He disappeared after a kiss in the rain. But it wasn't the silence that followed that kept Nico awake for nights. It was the shoes, soaking wet, sitting quietly outside the gates of a church no one had entered for years. Shoes don't lie. People do. The night before, under the pale haze of a street lamp in Seville, Nico had stood in the soft drizzle of spring rain, holding the hand of the man who never once dared to hold his, Lovaro Romero. With his shoulders always slightly hunched, his gaze lowered, his steps quickened when eyes turned, a man built from caution, gentleness, and fear. That evening, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the clouds broke over the cathedral rooftops. Maybe it was the fact that the world, just for a moment, felt still. As they crossed Plaza del Salvador, Lovaro slowed, and when Nico turned to him with that ever-patient softness, Lovaro did something he'd never done before. He reached for Nico's hand. His fingers were trembling, but they didn't let go. They walked like that for a while, quiet, unrushed, until, without warning, Lovaro stopped, pulled Nico close, and kissed him. It was not a kiss filled with fire or urgency. It was the kiss of someone choosing, in that exact moment, to stop hiding. It lasted only seconds, but for Nico, it was eternity. He remembered every detail, the way Lovaro's hair clung to his forehead, the soft inhale before their lips met, the warmth of his palm. For the first time since they met, Lovaro allowed the city to see him as he was. And then, just as suddenly, the moment ended. They ran laughing through the puddles, Nico's sketchbook tucked under one arm, Lovaro's coat clinging to his back. Back at their rented room above the bookstore, Lovaro dried Nico's hair with a towel, kissed his shoulder, and said, "Sleep." Nico did. But in the morning, the bed was cold. There was no note, no message. Lovaro's phone still lay on the dresser. His wallet remained, only his shoes were gone. Nico ran down the stairs, heart pounding, searching each corner of the plaza. Every narrow street that had once felt so full of promise, until he reached the old church. It stood there like a ghost, swallowed by ivy, flanked by iron gates that hadn't swung open in decades. And right in front of those gates, two soaked shoes, Lovaro's. Nico stood there for minutes, maybe longer. Tourists passed, a child cried in the distance. The wind shifted the ivy on the stone, but the shoes did not move, nor did the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He didn't pick them up. He couldn't. Later, when he sat on the church steps with the evening sun stretching long shadows across the cobblestones, he whispered into the empty air, "What are you trying to tell me?" Nico wasn't religious, but that church, that place Lovaro once called cursed by memory, now held everything he couldn't explain. He opened his sketchbook, and for the first time in days, didn't draw. He simply looked at the church tower, the rusted bell, and tried to remember what had Lovaro said about this place. His memory offered fragments, a childhood visit, a secret never spoken, and a sentence Lovaro once muttered in sleep. "Don't let them ring the bell." Nico looked up at it now. It hadn't rung in years, but something in the silence rang louder than sound ever could, and he wondered what kind of love leaves behind a kiss. And a pair of shoes. If this story speaks to you, if you've ever loved someone who was afraid to be seen, stay with us, because what Nico finds next beneath that tower may change the way we see love. Forever. This is Heart Stories. If you believe love deserves to be visible, share your voice below. Someone out there might need to read it. They were still there the next morning. The shoes, still wet, still pointed inward, as if Lovaro had stepped out of them and vanished into the air. Nico didn't sleep. He sat by the window most of the night, watching the alleyway below, hoping, praying, imagining he might see a silhouette rounding the corner. He didn't. At dawn, he walked back to the church. Nothing had changed. No footprints in the dust, no message scribbled on the wall, just the shoes. As deliberate as ever, he reached down and touched the leather, Cold, soft, familiar. Lovaro had once called them his invisible shoes, plain, silent, good for disappearing into a crowd. Nico pressed his hand against the ground beside them. It was damp, but not from last night's rain. It hadn't rained since. The shoes had been placed there deliberately. He stood, unsure whether to take them or leave them again. In the end, he left them. Not out of fear, but because they felt was like a marker, a boundary, a message. Back at the bookshop, no one had seen Lovaro. His co-workers assumed he'd taken a few days off. The manager, a quiet older woman, asked if Nico was the painter boyfriend, then gave him a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The truth was, no one knew anything. Lovaro's room had been left untouched. Bed made, window closed. His canvas sat folded under the desk, the one he only used when he felt safe. There was a note pinned to it, not addressed to anyone, not even signed. Just one line, written in his delicate handwriting, "Forgive me for not knowing how to be visible." Nico read it again and again, as if another meaning might surface, but it never did. He tucked the note into his journal. By the time the sun dipped low again, Nico found himself walking back to the church. His feet followed the path without asking his permission. The streets grew narrower, the stones beneath him older. And when he reached the gates, he stopped breathing. The shoes were gone. In their place was a folded piece of paper, heavy, handmade, the kind Lovaro used for sketching. Nico opened it slowly, careful not to tear the crease. It was a drawing of him. Not a portrait in the traditional sense, not precise, but it was Nico. The curve of his jaw, the loose curls of his hair, the way he bent slightly forward when listening. It was him, drawn through the lens of someone who had spent hours watching quietly from across small tables, park benches, balconies, and on the back, just 3 words. Words Lovaro had never said out loud. "You were light." Nico sat down hard on the stone step, the sketch trembling in his hands. He thought back to that rainy evening, the look Lovaro gave him before kissing him, the unspoken weight behind it, the storm not in the sky, but in the boy standing beside him. And now it all made sense. This wasn't disappearance, it was retreat. Lovaro had chosen a line in the sand, and Nico had crossed it simply by loving him in daylight. He looked up at the church. The bell above still hung heavy and still, but there was something different, something he hadn't noticed before. Near the base of the tower, carved into the stone arch above the old wooden doors, barely visible under layers of time and moss, were words, Spanish, weathered, fading. Nico leaned in, brushing the ivy aside, tracing the letters with his fingers. El amor verdadero no se esconde. True love does not hide. He stepped back, heart racing. Lovaro had told him once that his grandfather helped build this church, that it was the last thing he touched before he died. Lovaro never explained why he avoided the place, only that some truths live in stone longer than in memory. And now Nico wondered, was this inscription his grandfather's? Was this place once a sanctuary for someone who also had to love in silence? The ache in his chest deepened. Maybe Lovaro wasn't running from him. Maybe he was searching for a version of himself that he thought no one else could carry. Not even Nico. But he was wrong. The church wasn't empty, and Nico wasn't leaving. The sketch didn't leave Nico's hands for days. He kept it with him as he wandered through Seville's quieter streets. The tourist routes no longer mattered. What he needed to find wasn't marked on any map. He visited the cafes Lovaro loved, the quiet park bench near the orange trees where they used to sit without touching. He walked the length of the river where Lovaro once said, half joking, that water made him feel less solid, less visible. Each place was the same, and each place was emptier without him. At sunset on the 3rd day, Nico returned to the bookshop, not to ask, just to be near something Lovaro had once chosen. Luca was there that day. He recognized her from a photo Lovaro once kept on his phone, the only family picture he ever showed. In it, Luca was laughing, one arm draped around her younger brother's neck. Nico didn't expect her to recognize him, but when she looked up from the counter, her smile faltered. "You're the artist," she said softly, not as a question. Nico nodded. Luca glanced around, then motioned toward the back. They sat behind a stack of cardboard boxes, where the smell of ink and old bindings dulled the outside world. She didn't ask why he came. She only said, "He told me about you, not often, but when he did, it was the only time he looked lighter." Nico's voice failed. His eyes didn't. Luca continued, "I don't know where he went, but I know why." She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a paperback novel, worn around the edges. "He gave this to me the night before he disappeared. Told me if someone came looking, I'd know." Nico took the book with trembling fingers. Inside, tucked between page 86 and 87, was a folded piece of stationery, heavy paper. Lavaro's handwriting. He unfolded it, afraid of what he might find. "To the one who saw me before I did. If you're reading this, it means I chose to go. I don't know where I'll end up. I only know I needed to leave the version of myself I was still performing. Please don't think you broke me. You were the only thing that made me feel real. But sometimes even love can't quiet the echoes of a house that told you, every day, that you were wrong for simply existing. I left my shoes there not to say goodbye, but to mark the place where I stopped pretending. The church is not cursed. Nico, it's where my grandfather once wrote the words he could never say to his own reflection. True love does not hide. You made me visible, and because of that, I need to learn how to stay visible, even when no one's watching. If I find that version of myself, I promise I'll come back." Nico didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until Luca placed her hand gently over his. "He tried to come out once," she said. 2 years ago. To our mother, she didn't shout, she didn't hit. She just walked out of the room and didn't speak to him for days." Nico nodded. That kind of silence was its own form of abandonment. She wasn't cruel, just afraid of what others would think, of what our neighbors would whisper. And Lovaro, he absorbed it all, like it was his duty to make her comfortable, even if it meant making himself small. They sat in that quiet for a long time. Then Luca added, "But you're the first person he didn't try to shrink around." Nico didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. When he left the shop, the sun had already dipped beneath the rooftops. He walked slowly, the letter pressed against his chest. There was no resolution yet, no trail to follow. But there was something new, a layer he hadn't expected. He wasn't looking for Lovaro anymore. He was waiting for him. The bell never rang. Day after day, Nico passed the church. The shoes never returned. Neither did Lovaro. But Nico did, not to wait, not to beg, but to understand. The silence of that place wasn't empty. It carried the weight of stories untold, generations buried beneath stone and memory. Nico began to see the church not as a scene of disappearance, but as a kind of confession. Lovaro had chosen it not because it erased things, but because it remembered. Nico started drawing again, not just Lavaro's face, but every place they'd shared, every gesture Lovaro made when he thought no one was watching. He filled the pages with details no camera could catch, the way Lovaro traced the rim of a coffee cup when anxious, the slight tilt of his head when he listened, the way he never sat fully relaxed, as if his body was trained to stay ready for rejection. These sketches weren't for showing. They were for holding, for anchoring. One morning, he returned to the church carrying something more than his sketchbook. In a canvas bag, he had brought a small brass plaque. Nothing ornate, just a line, etched in clean, quiet letters: "El amor verdadero no se esconde." True love does not hide. He didn't ask for permission. He found a space on the side wall, between two moss-covered stones where others had carved name, prayers, initials. Some were nearly erased by time, others fresh. Love, grief, hope, all pressed into stone by hands that needed to speak. He knelt, cleaned the surface, and fixed the plaque there with care, not to mark territory, but to name the silence, to give it context, to show that someone had been loved here truly, openly, even if only for a moment. An older man walking by paused. He didn't speak, but his eyes read the plaque, then flicked up to Nico's face. For a brief second, they simply held that gaze. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Or a memory too old to carry words. Nico nodded. The man nodded back. Later, Nico returned to the place where he and Lovaro had first met. It wasn't anything special. Just a small art gallery tucked between a bakery and a locksmith. Lovaro had walked in with paint on his sleeves, looking for someone else's exhibit, but he stayed. And that night, they talked for hours beside an installation of broken glass and mirrors, both pretending not to notice how clearly they saw themselves in each other. Nico stood there now, in front of that same gallery window. The display had changed, but the memory had not. He pressed his palm against the glass, not in mourning, in gratitude. Lovaro had vanished, yes, but what he left behind wasn't absence. It was proof. Proof that two boys once kissed in the rain and the world didn't fall apart. Proof that love, even when interrupted, leaves a mark strong enough to outlive silence. On his way home, Nico passed a group of teens near the river, laughing too loudly. One of them wore a hoodie with a rainbow stitched across the chest. It made Nico pause. Lovaro would have looked away, maybe even crossed the street. But Nico watched, a soft smile forming. That kind of ease didn't exist when they were kids, but it was beginning to grow now, in corners of the world where once there had only been fear. He realized something then. Maybe Lovaro wasn't meant to stay in one place. Maybe his role wasn't to be found, but to leave seeds. Acts of quiet defiance, gentle truth. And maybe Nico's role wasn't to chase him, but to carry him forward. Nico didn't expect the bell to ring, not after so many weeks. But one Sunday morning, as he passed the church on his usual walk, it did. Not loud, not triumphant, just a single clean note that echoed through the alley like breath held too long and finally released. He stopped, turned. The old door was open. Inside, the light slanted in through high windows, cutting soft lines across the pews. Dust floated like quiet confetti. No one was speaking. The church was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. Nico stepped inside. At the front, near the altar, a small gathering of candles had been placed on the floor. No names, no photos, just flickering light in a circle, as if someone had invited memory itself to sit and stay a while. And there, on the wall behind the altar, in that soft, washed-out stone, Nico saw something new. The words, the same ones Lovaro had left in his note. True love does not hide. But they weren't carved this time. They were painted, gently, carefully. In Alvaro's handwriting, below it, in smaller text, a second line, "If you are looking for me, you already know where I've been." Nico didn't cry. He smiled. For the first time in weeks, the ache in his chest softened into something warm, something that could live beside grief instead of against it. Lovaro hadn't vanished. He had shed a layer, left behind the version of himself that was never truly his, the scared boy, the silent boy, the boy who looked at mirrors and saw only conditions. And what he left behind for Nico, for anyone willing to look, was a trail not of breadcrumbs, but of courage. A courage that whispered, "I existed," and louder still, "I still do." That night, Nico walked back to his apartment and pulled out the old sketch Lovaro had drawn. He framed it, not for the art, but for the proof. He placed it by the window. And every now and then, when the wind shifted or the rain tapped softly against the glass, he would look at it and say aloud, "Just once, I saw you." Not to summon Lovaro back, but to keep the silence honest, to remind the world and himself that love never vanishes. It simply chooses new ways to be seen. What about you? Have you ever lost someone, not to distance, but to fear, and still felt them beside you? Somehow, if this story moved you, let it sit with you a little longer. And if your heart feels seen, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe for more true-hearted stories like this, from the shadows to the light, from silence to being heard. This is Heart Stories.